I think there is always a certain amount of consistency that I expect from wines from Alsace, and I think we saw that consistency, both of style and quality, really, throughout the tasting. There was a homogeneity, I think, in terms of what we tasted on a qualitative level, and good typicity, I thought, as well.
Yeah, certainly I would agree with that. There were a number of really lovely examples in each category that we tasted, which were Pinot Noir, Cremant, Riesling, Gewürztraminer. And, you know, of course, some flights showed more consistently or more positively than others, but we did find in each category some really special examples.
I think the identity of the grey variety coming up about what we were expecting, and I find the more homogeneity of the style prove the quality is there, and yeah, we're just waiting even better in the future.
I think there are always high expectations for Riesling in Alsace, and I think, for me anyway, those expectations were met. I think for me the surprise maybe was Pinot Noir, and how much Pinot Noir in Alsace has improved since, you know, my earliest visits some 20 years ago. I think there are some very, very fine examples of Pinot Noir being made in Alsace now, and I'm really glad that the region has got an increasing focus on Pinot.
No, I certainly agree with that. And I think that we ended up, when we were discussing this as a panel, which we did in some depth, that actually the more successful examples were ones where there wasn't so much oak. Actually, you know, there was a chance for the varietal in itself to shine in a kind of purity without being
overburdened.
Maybe that's it.
Maybe that's
a good word. Because actually there was enough ripeness. I don't know whether climate change has anything to do with that, but a sense of, you know, varietal purity and expressiveness that, you know, may not have been there when, you know, we were first visiting Alsace a number of years ago. But, you know, definitely, you know, where we did see oak, it's not necessarily always a positive.
I think the Pinot Noir, it's probably the one where, with the number we had, you can see the generality getting better. I think it's still also a little bit of variation, but it started to be better and better. And Gewürztraminer, it's more about the place, about the aromatic expression. After, for some people, it's maybe a little bit more complicated. And the Cremant, generally, it's pleasant and easy to access.
Mm-hmm. I think with the Cremants, I think, you know, most of them were made in this kind of very approachable, fruity style. And you do get this kind of riper, rounder palate than you would expect in Champagne, for instance. So quite often they're very accessible wines. But I did find that there were a couple of wines where you could see that they were trying to make more serious Cremants with more of that autolytic character and more finesse. So you know, maybe there is a sort of aspirational streak beginning to make itself felt among those wines.
Yeah, and there was a real range.
Yeah,
I think the wines that we voted top were all very different, and, you know, showed different characters, and, you know, that was really, it's really great to see, actually, because I certainly came into this not expecting quite that sense of variety and versatility.
Absolutely.
It's always great to see, particularly when you've got such a competitive category, particularly, well, in the UK market and others too, where, you know, you've got these two poles, competitive poles in the market between Prosecco and Champagne, you know, which we were discussing earlier, in fact, as panellists, and you're trying to find a point of difference, but also, you know, the value added in that kind of section of, you know, or profile of Cremant. And I think these wines show that is possible, and you can actually over-deliver in that area. Very interesting, I thought.
Except for me, the Crémant, I hope in the future maybe a place like supermarket or a wine shop like Majestic will have a view on it, because I think value for money, Crémant has got its place. I think the Riesling, we are fan obsessed with it in a good way, because we find quite easy, but also with a lot of personality. I think the Pinot Noir has got something to play about the fact that they're getting better, but also they are far cheaper than Burgundies. And maybe it will give us Raminer. It's a little bit more complicated, because you need to be almost in a subject with a specific food to complement with.
Yeah, I would say from working with Courtney and Barrow and having on-trade, off-trades view, Alsace is massively underrepresented. Ought to deliver outstanding value. I still don't quite understand why there aren't more Alsatian wines in the market, but that may be a number of reasons for that, and cohesion being one of those. But the Pinots, particularly in a market where Burgundy is the dominant category, is now are suffering significant challenges in terms of price and perceived value for money. Crémant, where you've got such opportunity. Riesling, the Rieslings from, as you said earlier, there's so many of these Rieslings from Alsace which are so extraordinary, and so many of them bone dry, and so much race and quality, class. You would have hoped that they would have also a relative advantage in terms of positioning. And then Gewürz, like you said, a bit of a niche nonetheless. The relative quality is great. I personally, I'm sure those views are shared here, would have loved to have seen some Pinot Gris here today. I think it's an outstanding category in terms of Alsace. I really hope that the wines, those who really champion Alsace would find a way to include that great variety and almost a category moving forward in terms of their promotions, because in terms of general drink and quality, and also value for money, I think that has so much potential. But perhaps in terms of there's, I would argue there's possibly an argument that it's too difficult to sell versus Pinot Grigio, but that's a shame, because it undervalues the potential of that entire area.
I agree. I think there are a couple of grapes that we didn't get to taste today that are potential strong points for Alsace. One of them is Pinot Gris, which yes, it's not as well known as Pinot Grigio, but I think more effort could be put into reinforcing its market position as a really versatile food wine. It comes in a diversity of styles. It's a grape that consumers are partially familiar with, and you could spin off that. I think also a grape that we haven't talked about that there is an opportunity for also is Pinot Blanc, especially given how very similar it can be to Chardonnay stylistically. I think there are huge opportunities, and possibly in the on-trade even more than the off-trade, because it is for both of those grapes, because they are potentially such food-friendly, make such food-friendly styles of wine.
And easy to pronounce.
and easy to pronounce. I think the Gewürzes, although they are magnificent and very easy to identify, I think people struggle with them slightly. I think people struggle to pronounce them when they see them on a wine list. And I think it's very difficult with, my learned colleague over here has some great food pairing suggestions for Gewürz, but they are quite limited in terms of the foods that they can be paired with, because they have such a dominant expression that I think they're quite intimidating for a lot of sommeliers and beverage managers in an on-trade situation. And I think it's a slight shame that the focus has been so squarely on Gewürz, which, you know, it can make wonderful wines, but I think the drinking occasions are relatively few and far between, whereas I think Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc, there is such a diversity of drinking occasions and price points that I think it's a shame. I think Alsace is missing a trick there. Having said that, moving on, I think there is, as both of you have said, I think there's a huge opportunity for Pinot Noir in a market where people are really priced out of Burgundy, and where the Alsace Pinots have come on in such huge strides in terms of quality and style. And I think that there's a huge potential in both the retail and the on-trade environment for those wines. The Cremants, I think that's more of a struggle, because I think they fall between two stools. They're not cheap enough to compete with Prosecco, and I think Champagne really has cornered the market in more prestige sparkling. So I think it's really, really challenging to sell Cremant unless you're going to hand sell it, and not every retailer or not every restaurateur wants to hand sell their wines. I think in terms of Pinot Noir, I would say step off the oak, unless you've got real concentration of fruit and a wine that is designed for long-term aging. And one of the wines that we picked for the tasting has that. It's a little bit oaky at the moment, but you can see that it's got the density of fruit expression and the structure to allow it to age. But I think one of the delights of Pinot is the delicacy of the fruit, and it's a shame to squash that under a layer of oak. So I would say probably take a step back away from the oak, because I think the days where you signified high quality by adding a lot of oak, I think those days are gone.
And trying to maybe ratchet back a bit. I mean, I know that's not easy, but you know, I'm not sure anybody wants to see a Pinot at 15. I know that, you know, there are many advocates that, you know, for, you know, balance is not about alcohol, but you know, I'm not sure that certain varieties, and I would Pinot among those, and perhaps, you know, particularly, you know, Alsace among other areas just doesn't wear it well. And you know, there's got to be some work, you know, presumably at the viticultural level, which, you know, would dial that back in very rich vintages like 2020. You know, we saw quite a few examples from there today.
I think it's really tempting if you come from an area where historically you had to chaptalize to get your wines to have high enough sugar to ferment them to make appropriate levels of wine. There is a temptation to see the current run of warm vintages and the artifacts of climate change as being an advantage, because warmer must equal better. But I think there comes a point at which that warmer equals better tips over into warmer equals a caricature of the wines rather than something better. And I think we're on the threshold of that in Alsace, as in so many other regions. And like you, I don't like to see Pinot at 15% alcohol, or even above 14%. I think 14% is kind of my limit, because, you know, otherwise it's too heavy, it's too burly, and
can't see the detail.
No.
I mean, many of those we saw today were around 13, and they were. I thought that was their strongest suit, and our strongest, you know, wines among the flight were around that level.
Don't underestimate the value of a bit of crunch and freshness in red wines. Definitely. And in white wines.
I think we don't put the Pinot Blanc as its place, because it is the second biggest production by about the quantity, and most of the producers prefer to use the Pinot Blanc to the Crémant. But I think Pinot Blanc will be actually a very good way for the producer to actually open the eyes about the rest of them wines. And it is also something more French, as it's most of the time the price are very decent. And if you put a little bit of love in it, it's actually quite a pleasant and easy wine to understand and to appreciate. And I think we try too much sometimes to go too much where we would like to bring the people with very specific wines, and we miss a little bit of simplicity there.
We forget the appeal of a vin de plaisir.
Exactly. And vin de soif.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges is that Alsace is not as visible as it was 10 years ago, and I don't know whether that's because the English market is now slightly on the back burner. Maybe Alsace is having more success in the USA or somewhere else, but I think there is a danger that unless Alsace puts a bit more effort into more visibility in the UK market, that it will carry on diminishing in importance.
Do you know, I mean, I think that's very bold and very true. I wonder whether there is a challenge that nobody has come out and said, or perhaps there needs to be somebody who will come out and say, what makes Alsace Alsace? What makes that wine? What makes Alsatian Riesling Alsatian Riesling? What makes Alsatian Pinot Blanc? What makes Alsatian Pinot Noir? Sorry, it's getting a bit like a broken record, but I'm not sure, and I'm trying to recall who is doing that communication. And I think that we may need to do that better, and it's always a problem with collectives from around the world, whether it's Chileans, Argentinians, Burgundians or Alsatians. How do you communicate what makes you special? But I really do feel, I mean, it's true. It hadn't crystallized, but you're absolutely right. I do think that there is less visibility in the market now for Alsatian wines, where that you could argue, I mean, look at those labels. You could argue with any French region, if they don't have proper designers coming in and helping them. But those don't look like world-class wines, maybe with a couple of exceptions. And maybe, you need somebody to come in and help them on that too. Maybe does the flute bottles, work in an on-trade fridge? All these kind of different considerations. But somewhere or another, these brilliant wines that, as you've said, in an on-trade setting, as I know, selling to them, works so well. And yet, I think they are, as you've said, losing visibility. And that's a great shame and worry. For those of us who care about these wines and care about wines of a certain quality and style being represented in the UK market and beyond. In the better wines, you could argue that with everyone, but there is a sort of common ground of acid, texture, minerality, and a sort of subtle fruit that you would hope that is food friendly, delicious, quite consistent. We found consistency. It's very difficult.
Actually, I think that food friendliness, there is a diversity of great varieties and styles in Alsace, and yet as a collective together it's an incredibly food friendly suite of grapes and wine styles, regardless of whether you're looking at the more sort of linear austere Rieslings or something with a bit more generosity. You could go through an entire meal very, very happily with Alsace wines, and it kind of doesn't matter whether you're talking about French cuisine or a pub meal or an Asian meal. There is
Asian, particularly, I'd argue.
Wines they are incredibly food friendly because they have personality, but they, with the exception of Gewürztraminer, they don't take over the meal. They are happy to act as a supporting act for a really wide range of dishes, and I think that's what Alsace does so well, and perhaps that's what we need to be talking about more.
And Pinot Gris.
And Pinot Gris.
For me, what makes special, but also a little bit complicated. First, Alsace has got a number of grape variety, but after we have got a number of type of different soil, where the expression of some of these grapes are different from one. But after, from one producer to the other, it's quite complicated to know what you're going to test it if you don't know the product. That's been in another way. It's very difficult to buy an Alsace wines if you don't know who makes the wines. And I think at the time this bridge will be not built, it will be still complicated for the Alsace wine, even if it's getting better and better. But it is, that's why I almost hope one day the Pinot Blanc will be more present, because it will, I think, open the eyes of the public to be more available. That's all right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How very French, fait compliqué.